everyone, welcome to today's ParaBoss webinar. ParaBoss is Australia's resource for the control of worms, lice, flies and ticks in cattle, sheep and goats. ParaBoss, for those of you who haven't heard of it before and are joining us for the first time, welcome. ParaBoss is a joint initiative of Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, the University of New England and Animal Health Australia. So today we're going to be talking all about Hydatids, so the silent killer, Hydatids in the Australian cattle industry. And today I will be welcoming Dr Matt Playford shortly, and he will be giving us the presentation. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Fiona MacArthur, and I'm a member of the ParaBoss extension team, and I live on the Northern Tablelands in New South Wales. Here we go. I have you up now, Matt. Thank you very much. I'll pass over to you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Now, look, my own personal experience with Hydatids started when I was in primary school, and I went to school in a little school called Mullian Primary School in Cowra. And one day in the mid-70s, a van pulled up and these people hopped out and they said, "We're here to tell you about Hydatids." And the reason was because a lot of people around that area had become infected with Hydatids, and they saw it as a major public health issue. Now, at the time, we thought it was fairly scary because they showed us pictures of people with big tumours in their organs and getting surgery, and we thought it was worth responding, and a lot of people at the time did, and the incidence of Hydatids in people decreased. However, in recent years, we've found out that the incidence in cattle has expanded, and now it's a major problem both for the health and productivity of the cattle, and it still remains a problem for public health, and on top of that, for international trade. So we'll have a bit of a drill down and look at some of the details of Hydatids in the cattle industry. Now, I actually did my doctorate in Hydatids disease in Hokkaido in Japan, and you can see there's a laboratory here that's the parasitology laboratory, and I spent 4 years in that laboratory doing a lot of trials and studies and looking down a microscope. And the reason is because Hydatids is a big problem for public health in Japan, particularly in Hokkaido. And there was some 300 people had to undergo surgery at the time I was there, and they were still discovering dozens of new cases every year. So they put a lot of effort into it, and I'm very, very grateful that I was able to share that experience with Professor Kamiya and the other researchers who were so generous in teaching me about Hydatids. Now, over there, Hydatids is mainly spread by foxes. And of course, the fox is a potential source of infection in Australia, but it's not as important as dogs. And that includes both the pets that we have around the house, working dogs, and also wild dogs, including dingoes. And so let's have a bit of a look at some of the details. Now, you probably wouldn't know if cattle were infected with Hydatids, and the reason is because it takes a long time, in fact, many years, for the cysts to grow up to be large enough to interfere with the animal's normal functioning. If they're in the lungs, they might be a bit short of breath. If it's in the liver, they may have, certain problems. If it's in the brain, they may show neurological signs. But unlike people, cattle generally don't have a very long lifespan. And so the disease, the slow-growing cysts in the organs of humans are much more likely to affect the health of the humans than they are the cattle. However, it is so widespread and there's so many cattle are infected now that it's been estimated that Hydatid disease is costing The Queensland beef industry alone, $100 million per year. Now, that's based on the cost of lost beef yield for each carcass, lost weight gain, and also the fact that so many organs have to be chucked out and not saleable. And what do we mean by this? And thanks to Professor Constantinoiou, who's provided this picture. That's a picture of hydatid cysts in the liver of a cattle beast. And you can see that instead of the normal liver tissue, which we see at the bottom, there's cysts there that are about 5 or 6 centimetres in size. And those are the cysts that actually contain the larvae of the tapeworm. So if a dog was to come along and eat that liver, it would develop the tapeworm in its gastrointestinal tract and pass on the infection. Now, of course, hydatids does involve other organs as well. It can be found in the heart, in the kidney, even in the brain. And these are pictures from a study in Brazil where the meat inspectors actually went through and they found hydatid cysts in various parts of the cattle. And also the lung. This one is from Egypt and shows a hydatid cyst in the lung. So very common place for animals to become infected. Now, fortunately, we have some active researchers in this field in Australia, and a lot of the stuff that I'm presenting today comes directly thanks to the many years of work by Dr. Cara Wilson and Professor David Jenkins from Charles Sturt University, and Cara is also at Central Queensland University. So we have to pay tribute to these people who've done all of the recent work on trying to define exactly what's happening, particularly in the northern beef industry with hydatids. So in terms of what producers are doing to prevent hydatids, unfortunately, 86% of the producers surveyed didn't deworm their dogs enough to prevent hydatids infection. And they did also, 19% fed their dogs raw offal or meat products. 82% confine their dogs so that they're not wandering around eating roadkill or dead animals in the paddock. But 71% don't dispose of offal safely. So this gives us a lot of insight into how routine practices can impact the incidence of disease. The other thing is that most of the producers surveyed said that they're not well enough informed. So we really do need to lift our game to try and provide relevant, timely information for producers so that they can work out what are the things that are going to really impact not only the incidence of hydatids in the cattle, but also reduce the risk of people on the property becoming exposed to hydatids and getting infected themselves. Now, critically, almost all of the respondents in the survey done by Dr. Wilson said that they would take action if they knew their cattle were infected. So that gives us a lot of comfort to know that if people know that their cattle are infected, they would take the appropriate measures to decrease the risk. Okay, well, look, this map pretty much shows us from the abattoir surveillance that was done on cattle that were sourced from across New South Wales, Queensland, and the Northern Territory, but only a very small part of South Australia and Victoria where the hotspots are. And we can see that the incidence in Central Queensland is the highest. 25 to 40% in prevalence of hydatids disease. Then as you come down the New South Wales North Coast and the South Coast, very, very high prevalence. And it remains quite high in a lot of the shires across Queensland and into the Northern Territory. Looking particularly at Central Queensland, there's a large tract of country there where it seems to be that we have a high level of suitability for the survival and spread of hydatids. Now, it's been estimated from these surveys that 33% of the cattle slaughtered in Queensland during the period of this survey were actually infected with hydatids. So a huge number of our cattle are getting infected. And again, the hotspot in central Queensland and also on the north coast of New South Wales in those very high cattle populations around Casino to Grafton. When we look at the Northern Territory, it's definitely not exempt. And even though the numbers aren't high, because the surveys were only looking at cattle that were slaughtered in eastern abattoirs, there's enough there to let us know that, yes, there is also quite a bit of hydatids circulating in the Northern Territory. Now, one of the primary reasons why we're interested in hydatids, which is also known as echinococcosis, because it's caused by a parasite called echinococcus, is that it's a major human disease. And across the world every year, there's something like 19,300 people that they know die from this disease. Now, not only that, the people who are infected and survive are left with major surgical interventions, very similar to having a major tumour or cancer cut out of their body. And so the World Organization for Animal Health want to know exactly what's happening around the world because they write the rules for world trade. And if there's a risk to world trade from hydatids, then they have the opportunity to shut down trade or intervene in some way. So Australia is required by the rules of world trade to report how many cases of hydatids we're getting, not in people, but in the carcasses of animals that we're exporting. When we look at the disease in humans, this is a scan of a human brain. You can see that big round black spot taking up about half the head is a hydatid cyst. And when surgeons go in, they find great big fluid-filled cysts that they need to very, very cautiously remove. And I can't imagine how they do this from a brain of a living human person, but they take cysts out of lungs, out of livers, and many other organs. Now, the reason why they have to do it so cautiously is because cysts are filled with daughter cysts, each one of which can create a whole new infection. So if they spill, if they break the cyst, for example, break the cyst wall, the daughter cysts are like sand inside and they can spread throughout the entire abdominal cavity. And they'd be almost impossible to flush out. Each one of those little specks, those daughter cysts, can start up a whole new infection, which of course will grow up over the course of time and require further surgery. Okay, the basic life cycle of hydatids, or Echinococcus granulosus, involves dogs, which are in parasitological terms, they're the definitive host because they have the adult tapeworm inside them. And when they pass their dung, they do a poo, usually on a paddock somewhere. That contains the adult tapeworm and the tapeworm segments and the tiny little eggs that break out. And then the cattle accidentally ingest the tapeworm eggs as they're eating the grass, and then the cysts grow up inside the body of the cattle. Then, of course, if the dog gets to eat the organs of the cattle, or the sheep for that matter, or the wallabies or whatever other species is infected, then they'll get infected again and the life cycle is completed. So there's several areas where we can intervene to stop that life cycle being completed. and decrease the risk of hydatids being a threat to our cattle, our industries, and the people who live on our properties. Now, this is a picture of someone who's put a glove on and they've poked their finger into a patch of dog poo, and you can see there's dog poo all over their finger, all over that glove. And then inside the dog poo, there's these little white shapes. They're only about 5 or 6 millimeters long, less than a centimeter long. These are actually the dog tapeworms. And you might be thinking, oh, well, I've seen dog tapeworms, they're much bigger than that. This is as big as they get. So this particular tapeworm, Echinococcus granulosus, only gets to this size. This is the maximum it gets to. There are other dog tapeworms that get much bigger, much more impressive, but they're nowhere near as dangerous as this little fella. These are the most dangerous for humans and for our trade compared to any tapeworm in Australia. So if you see something like that, please avoid contact, because these are potentially lethal. These things can transfer infections to humans, and let's face it, the people who are at most risk are the children, because they don't have the same sort of understanding of hygiene that adults do. They're less likely to wash their hands after they've played with the dog, or wash their hands after they've been, in the garden or in the sandpit, and so unfortunately are more likely to get infected than adults. These are the culprits, these little tapeworms here. So just for the that lives inside the dog's gut, and they lay eggs that come out in the dog's poo. And occasionally when people touch animals, they become infected. Usually what happens is that tapeworm egg goes onto the grass and it can be ingested by sheep, cattle, kangaroos, even pigs have been found to be infected. So wild pigs have a reasonably high level of infection and can complete the life cycle. That's why dogs to eat roadkill from, for example, wallabies or kangaroos, the offal of sheep or cattle that have been slaughtered, and in particular that we avoid feeding them any of the organs that have come from those animals. However, that doesn't mean that the meat is exempt, because the Hydatids can live in meat, and we can actually complete the life cycle by giving meat to dogs, raw meat. Now, the dogs that are completing the life cycle might be domestic dogs, or they might be dingoes or foxes. They're all capable of eating organs and completing the life cycle. When we look at the liver of cattle, cattle have got a very strong immune system, and often we'll find that they've already accounted for the live hydatid cyst and they've killed it, and all that's left behind is fibrous scar tissue. And so this is a fairly common finding where we look at the liver of a beast and we see these remnants, which are essentially just scar tissue, fibrous tissue, laid down as the animal responds with its immune system to the infection. So not tolerate any type of lesion like this. They're very happy to say, well, that one goes down the bin. Let's get rid of that. And I know the liver might not be a particularly costly organ, but I think once you do that 100 times, you've just lost $680, which would be very handy if it was in your pocket and not going down the bin. So just to reiterate, the life cycle relies on the dogs. The dogs are the ones that actually carry the infectious particles and give it to people, and also to cattle. The cattle carry the larvae, and so if dogs eat the organs from infected cattle, they'll get the infection back again. Okay, so that's enough about the basic biology and life cycle. Let's see what we can do to prevent the risk of hydatids to our export trade, domestic trade, to the health of our cattle, and also to our workers and family on property. The first thing is look at the feedback reports that you get from your processor or livestock data link. Second, treat dogs with praziquantel and don't feed offal or raw meat. Now that treatment, praziquantel, we'll look at some of the products that contain it and some that don't, but it's almost like the magic ingredient for dealing with tapeworm in dogs. If all wormers don't contain praziquantel, they won't kill the hydatids. And the third thing we can do is wild dog control, including exclusion fencing. Now, some of the processes that I've dealt with recently are on the front foot, and they're very, very keen to include a lot of detail in the feedback reports that they're giving to beef producers. And it's great to see, and we have to give them credit for actually leading the charge with this, along with Meat and Livestock Australia. And because they give such detailed feedback reports, we're able to then hand over data to the very skilled epidemiologists like Dr. Shepherd, and they can actually work out the economics of these different diseases and how much they're costing us. So if we look at the current system, this is authorised by Meat and Livestock Australia and Integrity Systems, and it gives you feedback that you can log in and get through Livestock Data Link. Now, all that requires is that you're an MLA member and you can access all of this data. However, Livestock Data Link was really just the pilot program, and it's now given way to the MLA feedback system. And once you log on to the MLA feedback system, you can go in with your LPA PIC account and then log in, and then you can actually get all the data you need about the animals that you've submitted to the processors. Now, what we've found is that liver condemnation is the first part of the costs. And so that's an estimated $6.80 per infected animal. But then other organs are often included. 17% of the condemned organs are due to hydatids. It really is a very common infection. When we look at the ongoing costs, though, we get a lot of insight from the study that was done by Melissa and Matt George and Andrew Kotze in 2020, which was a feedlot study. When hydatids was detected, the average daily gain of feedlot cattle was reduced by 5%. Live weight was reduced by 8.7 kilos, and the hot carcass weight was reduced by 7.2 kilos. So that's really where the rubber hits the road. Hydatids causes a lot of less meat in the carcass, saleable meat in the carcass. And on top of that, there were impacts on the dressing percentage, eye muscle area, rib fat, P8 fat, fat colour, osmeat marbling, pH, MSA index, and meat colour. And so there'll be a general downgrading of the carcass value apart from that 7.2 kilos of reduced hot carcass weight. Okay, so once we've established if we've got hydatids and the level of hydatids in the cattle that we're submitting to processors, then we can start thinking about how we can treat the dogs to prevent hydatids tapeworm. And the first thing is using that magic ingredient, the product called praziquantel, which is in some of the tapewormers. Now, the original one was Droncet, and it's a standalone praziquantel tablet, Droncet tapewormers for dogs and cats. Now, on the label, it says to prevent hydatids, you need to give that every 6 weeks. Practically speaking, if we can get everyone giving it 4 times a year, there'll be a material difference in the amount of hydatids that we see in the cattle and the risk to people. So if you're not currently using a tapewormer for dogs and cats, I'd strongly encourage it. We look at the most popular products for dogs at the moment, for worming dogs, and think they're mostly aiming at diseases such as fleas, paralysis ticks, heartworm, and other intestinal worms. And so even though they're excellent products, they're really good at what they do, they don't kill tapeworms, so they're not suitable for hydatids prevention. Even Bravecto, which I think is a very popular product for dogs, does not contain praziquantel. So a very, very good product against fleas, ticks, heartworm, and other problems like that, but doesn't contain praziquantel. Your dog wormer, to protect against hydatids tapeworms, has to have praziquantel. So all of these products, and of course there's others as well, do contain praziquantel, and so these are the ones that you need to be using on a fairly regular basis. So again, unless the product contains praziquantel, it's not going to be clearing up those hydatids tapeworms. Now, the best place, of course, to get your wormers from is from the veterinarian, and you can quiz them about the ingredients in the dog wormers and what they're going to kill. Unfortunately, once the hydatids get into the livestock, so whether it's cattle or sheep, or even the feral pigs or the kangaroos that also transmit hydatids, there's no treatment available. Nothing we can do will fix them up. There has been a vaccine proposed for introducing to prevent this disease in livestock, but it has not yet been delivered in Australia. Now, the second part of this to prevent dogs from getting hydatids in the first place is not to allow them to feed on offal, roadkill or carcasses, and so that will avoid the life cycle being completed. So dogs will actually go and chew on dead animals in the paddock, whether it's dead livestock or pigs or other animals that have died in the paddock, and they'll pick up the infection. And so we have to remember that these carcasses are potentially infectious for our dogs. If we do want to feed them fresh meat, you can make it safe by freezing or cooking it. And the recommendations are to freeze at -18 for 5 days, or to cook it at 80 degrees for 10 minutes. And of course, the other part of it is when we do a killer, when we're actually sacrificing an animal for meat, or we're doing a post-mortem, we need to dispose of the offal and the dead animals, or the dogs will pick up infection, of course, from those organs that we discard. Now, if you're doing this on a regular basis, it is a good idea to have an offal pit. And thanks to the Victorian Department, who've provided these very detailed instructions on the best way to construct an offal pit. And of course, you want to make that safe for people as well by putting a lid over it or by putting a fence around it so that it isn't accessed by wild dogs. And that way you've got a very safe place to dispose of the guts. And of course, if you feed commercial dog food, that is completely safe, because not only has it passed through meat inspection, it's also been processed to make sure that there's no cysts or other infectious materials in that food. Okay, the third thing we can do is wild dog control, and particularly in extensive areas where exclusion fencing has been set up. This is a very good way of keeping wild dogs and dingoes away from our livestock. Fortunately, there's a very comprehensive guide to managing wild dogs, and that's a 28-page booklet, and you can download that from the Centre for Invasive Species Solutions. So if you go to that webpage, Invasive Species Solutions, download the glove box guide. That will give you all the options for both excluding, trapping, shooting, poisoning, other ways of managing wild dogs. And the other good source of information is the National Wild Dog Action Plan. And that's available on this website. And again, there's a lot of resources there to help you protect your cattle from the effects of having wild dogs around. Okay, so just to summarise what you can do. The first thing, you can check your feedback reports from your processor or from the MLA feedback, previously known as Livestock Data Link, and find out just the level of Hydatids there are in your cattle. Second, you can treat your dogs regularly with that magic ingredient called praziquantel, and also don't feed them offal or raw meat, or allow them to have access to carcasses either in the paddock or roadkill. And the third thing is wild dog control using exclusion fencing, trapping, shooting, poisoning, or other means to make sure that the wild dogs aren't contaminating the paddocks for your livestock to pick up Hydatids. Okay, now there is one more research study that's only just been published that summarised the investigations of Hydatids in cattle and tried to correlate the impact on weight gain. And they've found that there is definitely an association between Hydatid cysts in cattle and loss of weight gain, but it's probably not causing that weight loss directly. One other thing that came out of this most recent research paper, and you can see the rockstar researchers' names here who've put together this paper, is that they've given us an updated map that includes more regions on it to show us exactly where Hydatids has been found and not found in cattle. And you can see that through most of Victoria and South Australia and Western New South Wales, most of Southern New South Wales, there's very low rates of Hydatids in cattle. And it's not until you get up into Northern New South Wales and particularly up into coastal and central Queensland that we see very high numbers. In fact, in some of those places, about half of the cattle that come through the processor have had Hydatid cysts detected. So that's a more up-to-date map of distribution. Unfortunately, the areas that are coloured light blue didn't have any cattle tested, so we're still a bit in the dark about what's happening in Western Australia. All right, well, if you want to run through the questions then, Fiona, I'll do my best.
Okay, our first question is from South Africa. An agricultural advisor and farmer wanted to find out the difference between measles and Hydatids, please, Matt.
Yeah, so measles is actually two conditions, one in cattle called beef measles, and the other one in sheep called sheep measles. They're very similar tapeworm diseases of dogs that then go into the carcasses of animals. So Hydatids is caused by this little tiny small tapeworm called Echinococcus, and then it's got a close relative called Taenia saginata that causes beef measles, quite a long worm in dogs. And it's, of course, in South Africa, very rare in Australia, maybe once every 10 years we detect it. But very common in Australia is sheep measles. And I'm afraid that it's one of the most common problems that our meat inspectors and people in the processors need to trim off sheep carcasses. So they're completely separate species of tapeworms in the dogs, but they're very, very similar. They're close relatives.
Thanks, Matt. I'm just trying to make sure I record all these questions for everybody too. What do you think is the reason for the apparent lack of hydatids in most of WA, Matt?
Look, I don't think it actually is a true lack of hydatids in most of WA. It's just that the surveys were done in the eastern states and we haven't yet caught up with the true picture in WA. I'd be very surprised if we didn't find hydatids in WA, because we know that, for example, ovis, which is what our friend from South Africa has just mentioned, sheep measles is quite common over there. So I'd be surprised if we didn't have hydatids in WA as well.
Thanks, Matt. Matt, a very recent news is that MLA and Verbac have funded a study by Vicky Brooks, Carla Wilson and Tamsin Barnes with the great cooperation of Tees and Dave Jenkins advising. This is about to be published. It shows hydatids does not cause weight loss, that it's a correlation, not a causation. So that's an interesting comment there that's come through from Robert for you.
Thanks, Robert. That'll be really interesting to see.
If there is a paper out there on something new, Matt will find it, Robert, that's for sure. Next question. Does ivermectin treatment on cattle prevent or kill hydatid worms?
No, unfortunately, because ivermectin doesn't actually have any impact on tapeworms, either in the dog or in the cattle. And so there's nothing we can do to actually treat the hydatid cysts in cattle.
Thanks, Matt. Can you elaborate further on the role of sheep and tapeworms, please, in the life cycle, I'm assuming there, Matt?
Yeah, so for the Hydatids tapeworm, the tapeworm itself is in the dog, and sheep are a very good intermediate host. So they actually will carry the larval cysts. Now, that's quite different, again, from the tapeworms that we see in sheep themselves, which are, big, long tapeworm, and they come from the Monesia tapeworm family. They also have their own intermediate host or secondary host, which is little tiny oribated mites that live in the grass. But they're quite different from these tapeworms that are in dogs and cause larval cysts in sheep. Treating the tapeworms in sheep won't affect the hydatids at all. It doesn't have any impact.
Thanks, Matt. Is there a recommended wormer for dogs that does ticks as well?
Look, to tell the types of wormers on our dogs, the ones that are directed
Matt,
at ticks.
Sorry, Matt, I just lost you for a minute there. So could you start the answer again? And I might actually get you to turn your webcam off just so we can save any bandwidth from your end.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question. But at the moment, no. All of the products that are directed against fleas and ticks don't kill Hydatids tapeworm. So you have to give two separate treatments.
Thanks, Matt. What's your understanding of the difference between myositis and eosinophilic myositis? Do you believe that there is a link between myositis and white muscle hydatids?
Look, there is a link, but it's not direct. Myositis and eosinophilic myositis are very common observations in the processes, and they'll report back to you on the carcass inspections. But it's actually caused by quite a different parasite, Sarcocystis. Most of the time it's caused by Sarcocystis, we believe, but it's also spread by dogs and maybe by cats. So it's also involved with dogs and involves, dogs eating offal, for example. So by addressing the offal problem with hydatids for dogs, we'll also be addressing the problem of myositis.
Thanks, Matt. couple of thank yous that they, even though it was cut short, people have still thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. So thank you very much. You did touch base on this, Matt. Are wild dogs involved in the presentation? But maybe you could give us a further comment, please.
Yeah, wild dogs are definitely involved.
Oh, sorry,
in fact,
wild
yeah.
pigs. Sorry, wild pigs.
Yeah, and wild pigs as well. Some very very detailed research work out of various parts of Australia, but involving lots of hunting wild pigs, has found that they are a part of the life cycle, and they will pick up hydatids and transmit it back to dogs. So wild pigs definitely involved.
Thank you. Can people get infected from eating meat that's been infected with cysts, and can people get infected via tapeworm segments or just via the eggs?
So the answer to the first part of the question is no. People can't be infected by eating the cysts that are in the meat or in the organs of the infected animals. The second part of the question is yes, people can become infected by eating the segments of the tapeworms, because the segments actually contain the eggs. So yes, that's absolutely right. They can become infected by eating segments of tapeworms.
Thanks, Matt. Is there a product at all? I know we spoke about ivermectin. Is there any product that can treat cattle on tapeworm in cattle? Sorry.
Yes, there is, and this is the same as for sheep. Cattle get tapeworm in their gut, big long tapeworms that aren't related at all to hydatids. They're quite a separate disease. Now, if you use a white drench, then that will kill about 80 or 90% of these tapeworms. It may not detach all of their heads from their from the places where they're hanging onto the intestine, but it does a pretty good job of tidying up tapeworm in cattle. So any of the white drenches, including albendazole, fenbendazole, oxfendazole, will do the trick. And of course, a triple active product that contains oxfendazole will also do the trick. So any of the white drenches, the so-called benzimidazoles or BZ products, will clean up most of the tapeworms that are in the guts of cattle.
Thanks,
but not
Matt.
hydatids.
A question coming through about the actual subspecies of the tapeworm. Is there any, do you know what the biological status is of pinnatus versus granulosus? And we can, I've added that to the list of questions to send through to you, so we can address that later if you need to look that up.
Yeah, sorry, I missed that. So Echinococcus granulosus is the Hydatids tapeworm that we have in Australia. But what was the other one mentioned, Fiona?
It's pinnatus, Pinnatus.
No, I'll have to take that one on notice.
So I'm going to pop all of the questions, though, for the people that have missed it as well. And Matt and I are going to put that into a nice big Word document, and we'll email that through to everybody that has been at today's presentation. One more thing. For tapeworm. Is Simparica worma a recognised product to treat dogs for tapeworm and hydatids? Matt?
Unfortunately, no. It will kill just about every other worm, but not hydatids. So the answer is no. You'll have to use a specific tapewormer on top of the Simparica.
I guess it's a little bit, Matt, like when we talk about worms in sheep, we have to not look at the product label, product name, but we have to look a little bit closer at the active ingredient that's in there.
Yeah, precisely.
Great. Well, that's brought us to the end of today's presentation, and I've already done my close-off slides, Matt, And that's all the questions that we have today that have come through. I'm just double checking that there's no last ones, but I will make sure I send them all through to everybody later on. Yeah, so thank you very much, Matt, for joining us, and for everybody who joined us for today's ParaBoss presentation. Sorry about our IT glitch, but it doesn't happen very often. So best laid plans and all, but thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to you all joining us next month to talk all about ticks in cattle. So thanks very much. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Fiona. See ya.
Bye for now.